Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julie Wigner. I'm the Executive Director of Alqist for Human Rights, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event launch of Alqist's latest research report entitled The Dark Side of Neom, Expropriation, Expulsion, and Prosecution of the region's inhabitants. This report outlines the human rights abuses that are committed in the context of the construction of the Neom megacity. Neom, the futuristic megacity built on the Saudi Arabian's Red Sea coast, is the flagship project and the crown jewel of Crown Princess Mohammed bin Salman's Economic Vision 2030. To diversify Saudi economy and make it less reliant on oil revenues. The Saudi authorities are seeking billions of dollars in investment for this project, as well as technical expertise from foreign partners. But they have already started committing a wide range of human rights abuses in this project. And contrary to the authorities' claim that this that the area earmarked for the Neom project is virgin land, it has in fact been inhabited for generations by predominantly members of the Huaytat tribe. And these members have been forcibly displaced, often without prior notice or adequate compensation or any possibility to complain. And they've also been harshly prosecuted with waves of arbitrary arrests. Most recently in 2022, we have seen harsh sentences handed down against them, including of prison terms of up to 50 years, even death sentences. And based on the first hand testimonies from victims, with much of the information never before published, our report really, shows a really grim picture of the situation on the ground. And with Neom only really being one project in many in the Vision 2030, these violations are being and will continue to be perpetrated elsewhere in the kingdom. This has already been shown by large-scale evictions and home demolitions of over a million, affecting over 1 million people in the 20 billion project of the Jeddah Central Development Project. So therefore, it's really kind of high time that companies involved in these developments, many of which are actually UK and US businesses, reassess their corporate responsibilities and avoid being complicit in such violations. And that's why it's my great pleasure today to welcome our distinguished panel with whom we're going to discuss both the report findings, but also sort of the implications for businesses. And I'll maybe do a quick round of introductions. To my right is Lina Al-Hathloul. She is the Head of Monitoring and Advocacy at Alqist for Human Rights. To my left is Isabel Archer. She's the Senior Labor Researcher for the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Right next to me is James Lynch. He's the founding co-director of Fair Square, and online joining us is Sarah Leah Whitson, the Executive Director of Democracy for the Arab World Now, Dawn. And I would like to maybe first turn to Lina Al-Hathloul to tell us a bit more about the findings in the report, the new info that the report shares, what are the most striking bits and pieces, and also if you want to tell us something about the research methodology about the report, how difficult it has been to really document and verify the information.
Thank you so much, Julia. Hi, everyone. As Julia said, I'm Lina Al-Hathloul. I worked on this report for many months now. It's been very challenging. As you may all know, at the very beginning of the displacement, all the information was open source. It was public. The people of the Huaytat tribe would tweet about the violations. You could have access to the people themselves. Everything was recorded, published on YouTube. You still have some of these videos online. And as you may all know as well, since Abdurrahim was killed, it's been very difficult to have any information on what is happening, because people started getting arrested, and the areas were heavily surveilled, and people were monitored as well, and forbidden from sharing any information. So starting from the moment where we couldn't really have any public information, we were approached actually by members of the Huwaitat who wanted to share what is happening. It took us a lot of time to build trust. It was difficult also to verify information. At the very beginning, we were only documenting things before sharing anything, and we did build trust. We received IDs of the sources, court documents as well, and first-hand testimonies of what is happening on the ground. Maybe just to start with the main findings of the report, not everything has been published yet, but we do have details of the dishonest compensation policies. So also that was at the very beginning a public information, because there was a defamation campaign against the Huwaitat with a hashtag saying the Huwaitat are not against displacement, that some sheikhs are against the resistance of Abdurrahim al-Huwaiti and so on. And it turns out that they were promised, they were given large sums of money to be part of this PR campaign. And many of the Huwaitat tribe were promised large sums of money to compensate the evictions. Many of them were handed really small amounts of money, and which meant that the ones who had to take a loan to thinking that they could buy a house with these compensation could not, so they had to be resettled in poorer areas of Tabuk, which are villages that are also threatened with displacement. So it really leaves a large part of the Huwaitat in very poor conditions, not knowing if they will have to be displaced again. And I would say that's the happiest part of the situation, because then we also started seeing that people started being prosecuted for resisting evictions. And the prosecution started, I think that it really echoes or is a parallel of what is happening in the global judicial system in Saudi Arabia, with many at the first instance lower sentences. Just one example, for example, is Abdullah al-Dakhil, who was first sentenced to 16 years and then on appeal to 50 years. So we have documented 47 members of the Huwaitat tribe arrested and detained, and 14 sentenced from 15 to 50 years in prison, and including also 5 death sentences. They're all sentenced based on the counterterrorism law, which is also used now for all kinds of activism and for online activism as well. The 5 people sentenced to death are, one of them is the brother of Abdurrahim, who was killed. So we have 3 of them sentenced to death based on approximately the same charges, which is creating a terrorist organization. That's the main charge. But the 2 others are sentenced in a military court, which is not transparent at all, and who were actually forcibly disappeared before we found out that they've been sentenced to death. So the 3 sentences have been confirmed in appeal. So we still have now the Supreme Court that could overrule the sentence. Just, for the procedure of how things went, many were held in solitary confinement for months. Just maybe to give one example, Shadli, who has been sentenced to death, he's been brutally tortured, including electrocution, beatings, exposure to extreme temperatures, sleep deprivation, and solitary confinement. Regarding the charges, again, you know, they're arbitrary, the procedure has been flawed, and what we see is that it's very broad charges, but they include creating a Twitter account to tear apart national cohesion. And these accounts, surprisingly enough, are not suspended yet. So we can actually take as terrorism, which is, you know, documenting and recording what was happening on the ground when the evictions were taking place. Also, of course, establishing a terrorist organization without providing any information on what they consider terrorism. But also, you know, surprisingly enough, it is explicit that they say they provide information to tear apart national cohesion, but then you understand that it's providing information to Human Rights Watch and journalists. So they word the fact that they provided information as a terrorism accusation, but it's just providing information to organizations and journalists. And another important charge is the wording is standing in solidarity with a dead terrorist, which is Abdelrahim Al-Hawati. So anyone who has tweeted about his death or killing has been charged on that. So these are the main findings, but you have all the details with the exact sentences for each. And I think, I mean, we can go in more detail later on.
Thank you, Lina, for giving us an overview about the findings of the report. And yeah, I mean, I guess we continue monitoring as event ends, and in fact 2 of the 5 death sentences, only the information about them only reached us 2-3 days ago. So I think, yeah, she mentioned 47 members arrested, and Tina, I think, sentenced to prison terms, 5 to death sentences. That means that 27 others are still facing unfair trial proceedings, and I guess, yeah, we'll see more heavy prison sentences and maybe death sentences being handed out in the near future. Yeah, and also thank you for sharing a bit of information about how difficult it really is to sort of source this info from the ground, and of course very risky also for the people involved, as they're later being charged with communication with NGOs and outside people. So let me maybe now turn for reflection to James, who has worked a lot on migrant workers and sort of in the context of business and human rights as well. Can maybe tell us a bit about the human rights assessment for companies operating in an environment such as Saudi Arabia, and how, yeah, you would assess the situation when it comes to the Neom Megacity project or other projects in Saudi Arabia.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really pleased to be at this event. 2 or 3 years ago, Fair Square did a piece of work with Amnesty, producing a kind of a brief, you know, for businesses on the human rights risks in Saudi Arabia. And in that piece of work, I think Neom really emerged as this kind of iconic case with human rights risks, you know, across a number of themes. So I think this is a really important event. I'm really pleased to be here. I think, you know, when we look at built environment projects, there's a very useful piece of work done by the Institute of Human Rights and Business, which looked at a kind of framework, like how do you assess these massive projects, like these mega projects or giga projects? And the way you can do it is look at the cycle. So it starts out by looking at how is the land acquired for a project, and then you look, for example, how is the constructed, and then you look at how it's used. And there's other elements as well. What's the design process? You know, what's the accessibility built into it? And I think, you know, Lina's just spoken to that first one, like how is the land acquired? What is the due process? And the report is congratulations to Al-Qust. It's incredibly important. It's very powerful. this has been a disaster. It's been a tragedy. And I think there are many, many shocking things in this report, but I think the vindictiveness of some of the prison sentences is one thing that leapt out to me, and I found quite sort of difficult to read. I think I won't speak to that in detail because I think Lina is the expert here on that. But I think, so I wanted to speak a little bit just to the construction element and to also the use, how will Neom, when it's completed, and we don't exactly know how it will look, like what are the major risks in that phase? I think the one thing to highlight is little is really known. Like even the legal framework for Neom has this sort of uncertain status. You look at its website and it says that Neom will be governed by progressive laws that are compatible with international norms and conducive to economic growth. And, there's been talk about how this will be a sort of, some kind of free zone with its own laws. What that means, we don't know. So that does make, that creates a huge uncertainty when you're trying to assess human rights risk. So what do we know? I mean, we know that the scale of, looking at construction, the scale of the need for labor in this project is going to be colossal. So the Neom is talking about in the next 3 years recruiting more than 400,000 workers who will, of course, in Saudi Arabia, be migrant workers who are at high risk of labor abuse. Now, obviously, I've been working for the last few years on the Qatar World Cup, which has had a lot of prominence. The issue of migrant labor in Saudi Arabia has been much more low key. Isabel's going to talk, I think, in more detail about the kind of issues migrant workers face. But in Saudi Arabia, this is, they are at extremely high risk, both because of the laws and practices. I think one thing I just wanted to flag from Fair Square's work is we do a lot of work on worker deaths. And just to look at the context, what do we know about how workers die in Saudi Arabia? Well, not very much. Saudi Arabia publishes no data about this whatsoever. What you can look at is countries of origin publish. And if we look at Nepal, which is one of the origin states, what they tell us is that 58% of workers who die, Nepali workers who die in Saudi Arabia, die of either work accidents, suicides, or they're unexplained. They're put down as natural causes or cardiac arrest. And what that ultimately means is that there was no proper investigation into their death. These are not meaningful causes of death. And when you look at the conditions that construction workers are in, it has serious implications if you're not investigating people who die suddenly. So that's 58%. Now we can probably apply those sorts of percentages to other origin states. So these are grave issues. Again, Isabel will go into more detail about this. I would just say that there is a lack of information about any kind of protection on the sort of corporate side at Neom. The organizers are not providing that information publicly. When I looked at their website a few years ago, there was a supplier code of conduct, which had a few vague references that you could maybe think had something to do with human rights. That I can't find that supplier code of conduct anymore. So that's not a good sign. I just wanted to touch then on human rights issues. What Neom is an active space, a place that is in use. And Neom as a smart city. We know from reporting that there is a strong intent that Neom be one of the most advanced smart cities there is, where there's a strong intent to use AI and mass surveillance for example, policing, and to build AI and surveillance into the way of life in the city. Saudi Arabia is one of the most enthusiastic users of surveillance tools in the world. This is well documented. It results in arrests. It results in torture. So there's already a huge concern about, for example, Google's plans to have a cloud server in Saudi Arabia. This really takes things to a new level. I think there is big questions for both companies who may be inclined to provide technology stacks in Neom, and those who may be investors in those companies. I think the example of Nokia is interesting here. Nokia in Russia, pulled out, last year, because it was well documented that it had been quite, it had played a key role in sort of establishing the SORM state surveillance network. So who's going to be the next Nokia in Saudi Arabia? I think this is the big question. So just sort of finishing just looking a little bit about how businesses should look at NEOM. It goes without saying that NEOM needs to be treated as a very high-risk project from a human rights perspective. And this is obviously companies in Europe and elsewhere now are subject to far more stringent human rights due diligence laws, modern slavery laws than they were in the past. So they have to consider, well, can they mitigate the kind of risks here? I think one thing I wanted to highlight is just because an abuse has in some way taken place in the past, does not mean that it is over. And I think I wanted to point that out specifically with forced evictions. If you are an architect or a designer who's going and making money off the NEOM project, like what is your responsibility with regard to the forced evictions and the persecutions of the Hoitat? These are ongoing gross violations which require, they need to stop, and they need an effective remedy. So companies that are involved are at risk of benefiting and profiting from those ongoing abuses. I think the final thing I wanted to highlight is human rights due diligence. That's clearly the model for businesses these days. I think a big question in this context is how can you do effective human rights due diligence? And this is something that the Al-Quds report highlights. I think that's really important. How can you do human rights due diligence in a context where defenders are not permitted to operate, where there are effectively no independent voices allowed to sort of provide credible assessments of risks? I think that's an enormous question both for businesses and investors, and I think it begs the question of whether risks can be mitigated.
Thank you, James, for raising these concerns. And I think these are questions that we should discuss once everyone has kind of contributed to the conversation. I would maybe now, before hearing more from Isabel on migrant workers' rights, turn to Sarah Leah Whitson, our online panelist, who, Dawn, the organization that she's leading, has also documented human rights violations that have occurred during the demolitions in Jeddah for the Jeddah Central Development Project. Maybe you would like to tell us a little bit more about that and all what implications that really has for U.S. businesses and or even for thinking further ultimately for U.S. policymakers and U.S. government.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. And I just want to echo, and I really want to take a moment to echo James's comments to congratulate Al-Quds for your report. I just read it today, and I really want to commend you on putting in the time and the effort to extract information that is extremely difficult to get, and the fact that you have all the details on the detainees, which is far more than I thought, their sentences, how the sentences have been increased. Really just fantastic work. And for those who don't know, I can tell you it's very hard work. With that, I'll talk briefly about the Jeddah demolitions. So at the same time as Saudi Arabia is moving to expel the native population, the indigenous population of where they're building their home, targeting mostly the Al-Hoitat tribe, there the number of people is relatively small. At the same time, over the last year, I think they're pretty much complete now, the government has undertaken a massive renewal renovation project for Jeddah that has entailed demolishing thousands and thousands of homes, impacting 1.5 million people who've been forced to move out of their neighborhoods. These are primarily working class, lower income neighborhoods, as well as predominantly migrant communities. So Sudanese communities who've been there for decades, Egyptian communities, Ethiopian communities, a whole range of communities who've been living in the poor areas of Jeddah, who have been abruptly, very similar to what we're seeing in Neom, evicted from their homes, not offered any meaningful compensation, in some cases not even being offered any notice, just finding out a day before that they have to move out because of a sign stuck on their door. And in addition to the individuals who are affected by this forced displacement, there is the impact on communities. This is really forcing communities to break up, and there's no way for them to move en masse to new neighborhoods. I think what is particularly important about the Jeddah demolitions and the construction of Nahom, in both cases is, one of the ways that Saudi Arabia is marketing itself, and now we increasingly hear some commentators adopting this approach, is that Mohammed bin Salman is carrying out radical reforms in the country, including building this incredible new technologically advanced city, including renewing and renovating the slums of Jeddah, and so forth. And well, you have to break some eggs to make an omelet is the sort of attitude and approach. And I think one point that we all in the advocacy community need to emphasize is that there is no waiver from crimes, from human rights abuses, from gross violations of international law, in even war crimes in Yemen, because there are reforms happening in some other segment. Those are not mitigating excuses or mitigating defenses to the fact that crimes are taking place when tens of thousands of people are evicted from their homes and see their homes and their livelihoods and their communities demolished and upended. James makes an incredibly important point of opportunity for advocacy for us in terms of the international businesses that are already known to be involved in constructing their home and will be involved in redesigning and rebuilding the vast demolished neighborhoods of the very large city of Jeddah. I think that is where we can successfully work to extract concessions and commitments for reform, just as we did in the construction of Saadiyat Island in the UAE, where construction firms agreed to make commitments with respect to their employment of migrant labor. I'm not exactly sure how we would remedy the displacement that, because particularly in Jeddah, it's already taken place. But at least to find an avenue for engagement via the international community can at least provide us with some human rights leverage. I'll pause there.
Very much. Sorry. Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah Leah. And yeah, I think it's been interesting to hear, because I think the kind of patterns that we're seeing in the Jeddah demolitions are pretty similar to what's also happening in Neom. I mean, in Neom, we've been able to now really, unfortunately, see all these harsh prison sentences and even death sentences. But yeah, the kind of modus operandi of the authorities of not really giving any notice to the inhabitants and intimidating them, threatening them, and not providing adequate housing, no real remedy, no option to appeal is really the same. And I think it's important to see it in this larger picture, because Neom or Jeddah Development Project they're not two isolated projects in the kingdom. There will be far more, especially with the Vision 2030. And yeah, I think it's interesting. We'll talk a little bit more maybe about like concrete recommendations towards businesses and what they can do. We in our report have outlined a couple of suggestions, but maybe I can turn at Isabel Archer first, who deals a lot with businesses and their human rights responsibilities in such projects, and could maybe tell us a bit more from her perspective. And if you want to go into more detail on migrant workers' rights, then please do so.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks everyone for having me here. A couple of years ago, the Resource Centre and Al-Kis were in touch on the Neom project. And at that time, we were doing outreach to a couple of the particularly large management companies involved in the project. Very disappointingly at that time, the kind of responses that we had from those companies
the particular state that we're talking about. I think there are several sort of themes that emerge in these cases of abuse. So in particular, I'd just like to highlight that wage theft, the issue of delayed wages, partial payments, no payment at all is huge, particularly in construction, where this is an industry that is characterised by a lack of cash flow. So the industry of particularly large contractors, very complex sort of set of subcontracting going on. And what that means is that workers at the bottom of the supply chains are often the ones under pressure. Their wages are what is cut when contractors and subcontractors are not adhering to their contracts. Additionally, we know that recruitment fees are cited by workers in about 1 in 5 cases, but we do believe that to be an undercount of that. This sort of idea of recruitment fees encompasses a huge range of payments, and kind of understanding of what those payments look like varies hugely between different workers and employers as well. We also know that health and safety risks, particularly on construction sites. We've already heard from James on the research that FAIRSWARE has done into the deaths of migrant workers, which largely can be attributed to the risk of heat stress involved. We also work with experience on living conditions and also experience severe restrictions on fundamental freedoms, which I think is no surprise, already sort of explained why information is not readily available, the restrictions on freedoms of speech, movement, and association for workers compounds that. And I think it's also important to put the case of Saudi Arabia into this context. We've obviously just had the Qatar World Cup, and I think that one of the things which we've seen is a huge spike in reported cases of abuse of workers in Qatar and Doha in the run-up to that. One of the sort of points I'll touch on shortly is what businesses can sort of expect as that spotlight comes on Qatar. But I think it's worth sort of highlighting that while Saudi Arabia only actually accounts for 50% all of the cases we track, the actual number of people who will be impacted in Saudi Arabia is huge. Just a few kind of other points, I think, in light of this well-documented evidence base of the risks that migrant workers face in construction, multinationals will be or should be looking at any sort of construction project of this scale. It should be raising a huge number of red flags, but I think, disappointingly, I think the response of multinationals, generally speaking, to these construction projects has been quite slow, has not been sort of sophisticated. The industry remains extremely low.
So we don't know, it's very difficult to trace employment relationships and business relationships and see who sort of different supply chain actors are. Companies are not developing even on sort of paper policies to protect migrant workers. And I think that it's a missed opportunity for multinational contractors to recognize that they are in a unique position to fill the gaps that emerge in further down their supply chains. So, if it's the case that a subcontractor further down the supply chain is not paying their workers or is not doing enough to investigate the possibility that workers are paid recruitment fees, those are examples where it is beholden on a multinational company which has the resources and has the leverage to identify those gaps and remediate those harms itself. And unfortunately, that's just not what we're seeing at the moment. I think just to finish off, I think businesses, individual companies involved in NEOM or which are looking to secure work on NEOM would do very well to look at the experience of private sector who were awarded contracts ahead of Qatar 2022. So we saw, with the World Cup in Doha, we saw a huge amount of scrutiny. That came from the media, it came from civil society, from international organizations. But we also saw that companies that recognize their human rights responsibilities and got ahead of the human rights curve, so to speak, and put in place sort of policies, processes to safeguard migrant workers and recognize the specific vulnerabilities of migrant workers that workers are exposed to. Those were the companies that were then able to more meaningfully deliver on the commitments they had made prior to undertaking that kind of work. So that meant that they were sort of better placed to undertake investigations, to remedy harms that had occurred. And I think it would be a huge mistake for companies involved in NEOM to sort of rest on that lack of documentation that we heard from Lena. Just because, they should not be taking that kind of lack of expose as indicative that they continue business as usual in Saudi Arabia. And I'll stop there and hand back to.
Thank you very much, Isabel, for shining a light on the abuses migrant workers face, not just in Saudi Arabia, but really with the kafala or sponsorship system all throughout the Gulf countries. And maybe to also come back to a point that you raised, James, that this project, as well as many other projects, are really opaque, and the information we get is extremely limited. It's not just that it's very, very difficult and risky to document human rights abuses, but even those projects themselves, there's very limited information available. I think to the extent that even businesses that get involved sometimes don't have a clear idea of what this involvement entails, what the conditions are, what the legal framework is, that you bring in the Qatar World Cup, I think is also interesting in the context of Saudi Arabia, as there are these rumors of a potential joint bid of Saudi Arabia and Greece for the World Cup 2030. But also in the context of NEOM and all these other development projects, I think that heavily rely on migrant workers, this will be one very big risk. But there will be other risks, and I think we've touched upon it already. We've heard due diligence. How do you do this in the context of Saudi Arabia? And from our experience, I don't know if you want to elaborate on this a little bit, Lena, but we have been contacted by more and more businesses, which actually is a very positive development. And I think international scrutiny and the joint cooperation, that we've done together with the Business Human Rights Resource Center, kind of reaching out to these big consultancy firms that are part of the project, and the media coverage that then ultimately generates, really helps sort of shed the light on the violations, and therefore, in a way, gets businesses more interested to know about the risks they're getting involved in. So I don't know if you want to share a little bit about some of the exchanges we've had, and then we can discuss the question how to mitigate human rights context, and if it's even possible.
Thank you, Julia. I don't know to what extent I can share information, but yeah, we were positively surprised, I think, that we were by companies asking very explicit questions, and I need also your advice on how to speak to companies in these contexts. So basically, they wanted to know whether, and especially in NEOM, because I think all of them are already involved in Saudi Arabia, but they really wanted to know specifically with NEOM whether it was that whether they would be complicit, I would say, in the violations if they participate in any kind of project in NEOM. And it's, of course, I think that we have our position at Al-Qist. Amnesty does not have a clear-cut position on what business should get involved in NEOM or not, but then they have, they advise them to do their due diligence and so on. My personal opinion is that if companies are contacted by the Saudis to be part of NEOM and they refuse it, I personally don't think that it is anything positive unless they make it public. So for me, I always put myself in the shoes of the Saudis. I say, okay, if a company does come, I have 10 million other choices with other companies. So it really brings change to the image of Neom if things are public. So if someone boycotts Neom to be public. Another thing is, given that you have life of people that are at stake now with these death sentences, I think that, again, I think our recommendations are not that specific, but I'm emotionally involved in the case, and I would say that, you know, something easy to do is to ask as a precondition, for instance, to have the death sentences and the length sentences overruled before participating in any kind of project in Neom. And I think that is something that is not too much to ask from these companies, and not anything very philosophical or, you know, very broad recommendations. That's something that they could do and actually save people. Of course, in the long term, it might not, you know, change the policy in Neom and the way they treat the inhabitants, but at least for now, it can do something. So really being clear that they can bring change, even if it's short-sighted for now. This is a very emotional recommendation I have, because I've been working and being in contact with people who are victims. I think that, you know, they're the first people we think of now, but it's, again, I mean, I don't know if you provide advice to companies, but if they explicitly ask you whether they should get involved in not, what would be your response?
Yeah, happy to hand over straight away. Clearly, businesses have leverage. So how do we deal with that? What should we recommend as human rights practitioners?
So that we're asked, and I think you know, for a little bit of background information, working on human rights defenders and how companies can best use their leverage to support them. I think, I mean, the bottom line in terms of recommendations would be, you know, if you know, there's an ongoing risk, and as you say, these are not, you know, evictions are not final, the kind of ramifications are felt subsequently. You know, it's beholden on those companies to identify what the attack is, what the abuse is, understand what their relationship to that attack on the human rights defenders might be, and that might look differently, you know, depending on what the role of that company is in the project. It might be that they've been, you know, selling services or goods or products in some way which have been used to attack human rights defend. Might be that they are sort of complicit in another way, might be not taking action when they should be. And I think that's another thing which has come out quite strongly in communications from the UN Special Rapporteur and UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, being that companies don't just have a responsibility to not infringe on the rights of human rights defenders, but also to proactively use their leverage. You know, in terms of involvement with the local community, where possible, that would look like serious, meaningful stakeholder engagement with community leaders. If not with community leaders, with civil society organizations that are in touch with the local community. I think, obviously, that would then, that's where it becomes very difficult, the sort of building up that trust between company representatives and local communities. I think that's where organizations like that come in to potentially facilitate that. I also just want to sort of flag another act we haven't yet touched on, but is the kind of role of investors in also using their leverage with what companies can expect. And I think this is something which is important to flag. You know, we through our database, which tracks attacks on human rights defenders, globally speaking, that those attacks are increasing in frequency. But what we're also seeing is an increased tendency for the investor community to put this on the agenda, and that can look that looks like a sort of a couple of different things. I think, you know, some asset owners and some funds are requiring potential investees to show what their commitments are to human rights defenders before considering incorporating them into their portfolios. Others are asking kind of explicit questions of portfolio companies who they know are associated or have operations in particularly high-risk contexts. And you know, in the Gulf, particularly less related to human rights defenders, but more related to the risk to migrant workers, we're also seeing a a bit of I would say a trend, perhaps early days to call it that, but there are instances of European financial institutions divesting from their shares in companies which have operations in the Gulf, and where there's been, it's been explicitly articulated that is as a result of the risks to migrant workers from those companies' operations. So I just sort of highlight that in terms of conversations with companies. This is something that I think is coming down the line for many companies, and they are not aware.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I think it's a difficult one. I think businesses who are thinking about operating in this context, and investors who may be involved with those businesses, I mean, this is about asking really hard questions. It's about, as you say, it's about a proper engagement with stakeholders. It's about really understanding, like, what is the legal context that you're operating in here, and really identifying what the key risks are from your activities. Can you mitigate those? So can you if you are a construction company, can you actually protect workers in a context where unions are not permitted, where the kafala system, despite a kind of a sort of technical reform that took place in 2021, is still absolutely alive and kicking? Can you really protect workers in that context? Like, these are the difficult questions you have to ask yourself. And can you really understand the risks when you can't speak to any human rights defenders who are actually on the ground? When you're going to have to rely on largely people who are external, or sort of private companies that are able to operate in some way in this context, but under severe limitations. And I think it's not possible that the answers to those could be yes, we can. But I think, and can you also make a positive change? Can you use leverage to influence a situation where your business partner has been involved in the kind of gross violations that that this report documents, of forced evictions and the death penalty? Can you use your leverage? I think I think a lot of this depends on what the answer to those questions are, and I think investors need to be making really pressing companies on these, and tech companies, for example. How can their products be misused, and can you guarantee that they won't be? I think, going to your point, Lena, I think that is really interesting, that point, that if companies do decide to take this risk, then they have to be prepared to walk away. That has to be part of the deal. I always think of the example of Steve Spielberg, who walked away from the Beijing Olympics shortly before it happened, and that was actually to do with China's policy on its support of the Sudanese regime in Darfur. And he had tried to use his private leverage, and he sort of gave up and walked away. And I think that was really powerful. It was really damaging for China just ahead of its Olympics. And I think those, as you say, that does make a difference. And if influential operators with international credibility, because by going into partnership in this project, foreign companies are, as well as making money, they're also lending legitimacy and credibility. So they have to be prepared to remove that. So yeah, very, very difficult question.
Thank you, James. I would also possibly pass it on to Sarah Leah online again, if you want to add to that. Or we could come back to
I do. I'm sorry. I'm just having my screen
and in the meantime, I'm also happy to take questions in the room. If there are any, yeah.
Thank you. I'm Dania Akkad with Middle East Eye. I have a lot of questions, but I'll try to keep them small for now. I had watched in the report, there's mention of a child who's taken away, and I couldn't find his name in the list of people. I wondered what had happened to him. So that's a question. And I guess that's probably directed at Lena. And another follow-up question for Lena is, the documentation seems to be harder and harder to get. I've talked to other sources who have said court documents seem to be being withheld just so the media can't cover these things. Wondering your reflections on that. I'm not a business person. I don't know much about due diligence, but I wonder when due diligence is done right in foreign countries, what does it look like? And I know it doesn't sound like it happened in this case, but I wonder like how would it work if it was going to work correctly in terms of engaging human rights defenders? And then the last one, this is the last question. You had a really great table in the report of all of the companies involved. I know there was a letter in 2020 to 3 of them. Wonder if these other companies have been approached and what their answers have been. Thank you.
A lot of great questions. Thank you. And I'm going to hand it over to Lina to start answering the first ones.
Regarding the child, I don't know if you've seen that, but actually the information was open source of information because the grandfather in the video is still online. The grandfather explained what happened to the child. He's back with his family, but the brother and the father are arrested. That's for Salim. Regarding documents, yes, it's hectic, and the risks that some families take to be able to even just have a picture of court documents, or sometimes trying to take notes of charges to be able to provide that. But it's true that now in appeal, it's almost impossible to get any court documents. The death sentences, the documents were withheld. So that's for that. The military courts, that's impossible. I mean, no one has access. And not only for the Hwitat, I mean, it's also the case for so many other cases that we have in our annual report. It's only information from the families. We couldn't be provided court documents, and I do believe that it comes from a fear of having them published, or at least having evidence of what is happening. So unfortunately, yes, documenting is more and more difficult, and this is unfortunately what mainstream media cannot really understand, or they cannot report on it and cover these issues, because they have to have court documents that sometimes we can't even share, even if we have them. It's really becoming difficult, unfortunately.
Thank you. And maybe we can hear from our business and human rights expert about what good due diligence would look like, and then what companies have been contacted. I mean, just to add, it's a select list of companies involved in NEOM. It's not a comprehensive list, but I think that Isabel can tell us more about having reached out to them.
Just on the kind of the good examples. I mean, a lot of business and human rights work does tend to be quite focused on where things aren't working. But there are definitely some good examples I've been aware of. I mean, I think the first thing is honest reporting about risks and about mitigations, and you do see some good examples of that. There's been some good, for example, companies that publish human rights impact assessments and actually declare the risks, which may be politically sensitive. It may, cause an issue for their relations with the host government. That goes down. I think that's really, really important. I think, and notably in the case of Saudi Arabia, I mean, I was involved in an exercise recently where we wrote to, I think, 5 or 6 European companies, asking them what due diligence they did in Saudi Arabia, and specifically asked them, what are the risks, and I think one of them mentioned that they were worried about, heat, people working in heat, which is valid, but that was it. Out of 6 companies, all the potential risks you could have talked about, that was all we got back. So I think companies are genuinely concerned about the impact on them because of the sort of, the personalized style of governance and the potential for kind of backlash and impacts on your business opportunities. But I think also it's about engagement with, I think due diligence does not always it shouldn't be a sort of top-down process, right? If it's done properly, it should involve civil society actively. And certainly one good example I'm aware of is where, civil society organizations, trade unions, and worker networks themselves were actually involved in the process of assessing worker rights in the supply chain. And those are the sorts of things which, again, you have to have a degree of kind of free association and free expression for such things to be possible.
Thanks, James. Just quickly on the question about outreach to those particular companies, the Resource Centre has contacted those companies. We'll be making information that we've received so far public, probably this coming Monday or hopefully not too long after next week. So I'll be happy to share those. But I'm afraid I can't comment on anything particularly until then. On the human rights due diligence, I think James is exactly right. I think the starting point for companies has to be about confronting what's not going well or what's likely to not be going well. And there are no companies that I am aware of, or I think anyone would be aware of, that is not having some kind of negative impact in some way on human rights. That might be labor rights, it might be human rights defenders. And so the starting point has to be an assumption that somewhere in operations or in supply chains, someone is at risk. Absolutely echo the bottom-up approach. I think that's what makes due diligence in a context like Saudi Arabia or the broader Gulf or conflict zones very, very difficult, because it's extremely hard to get access to people who can describe what's actually happening on the ground. But I think that stakeholder engagement piece, the facilitating an environment where impacted communities, impacted workers are able to speak to their experience is absolutely vital. I think being honest about the information that can't be traced. I think companies are, we've said that they are particularly opaque in this context, but I think that there are companies who actually have no idea who is being subcontracted to. Often I would say that for an industry like construction, that's a huge risk. There's just this fragmentation of sort of business relationships and where people are employed and who has responsibility to ensure that people receive wages into their pockets, hugely fragmented. And so another kind of initial step has to be that sort of mapping and transparency, which can be very difficult. But I think my experience of engaging companies, and this is actually multinationals operating in the Gulf, so operating internationally, is that they are miles away from even beginning to understand what is required and being transparent. And we have asked that question about work. What actually more explicitly, not just what are human rights risks, but what are risks to your workforce? And we've been amazed by the responses that we've received. We've had multinational companies say that the most salient risk to their workforce is slips, trips, and falls in the Gulf as a labor rights risk. And so you can sort of see, we've also had companies, interpret that question as saying, what is a key risk to your business from your workers? And in the Gulf, a key risk is workers might wish to leave employment and go and work for another company. And these are multinationals. These are the biggest household name brands in the world. And you can sort of see how the understanding is very, very, very low at present. But I think that in an ideal world, certainly the transparency, the honesty about risks, and an assumption that they are already impacting human rights negatively, that has to be the starting point.
Thank you very much. That has all been very interesting. I think we started 5 minutes later, so we can potentially add another 5 if there are more questions in the audience, or also if Sarah Via is still with us, if she would like to add anything. But what I can hear sort of from the comments is that there's still a lot of learning that needs to be done or had with companies, and I think that ultimately they play a big role in, abuses that we see, or they potentially kind of implicated in the abuses, and they also could have quite some leverage. I think, especially with Mohammed bin Salman's Vision 2030 and those projects as they're going ahead, and we were trying to reach out not just to politicians, but also to businesses who are now more interested than they were maybe 2-3 years ago, which is a positive sign. And we'll be happy to engage with. But James, please, for some more comments.
It just sort of a further comment I was having, and I think builds on something that Sarah Lee mentioned. do think, again, if we're looking at this, I'm interested in parallels here, and it was very clear that when Qatar got the World Cup, it probably hadn't quite thought through the degree to which this would put the spotlight on the issue of migrant labor, and to the degree to which it would force it to engage with these issues in a way that hadn't happened before. And whilst I'm not saying that this is therefore a positive thing, because huge numbers of people suffered through that process, but I do think that, for example, that Neom is going to. I mean, I think what's interesting here is, for example, we're seeing already how the forced evictions and gross violations in Neom are then, in a way, drawing attention to the broader abuses against people in the land acquisition process, in redevelopment processes in Jeddah, for example, because Neom is this shiny, high-profile, kind of sexy project. Suddenly people are going to start thinking about migrant workers in Saudi Arabia in a way they haven't before, and I think that this is something that, whilst I don't want to suggest this is some kind of great opportunity and we can leverage change out of it, I do think that the state is going to have to confront these things in a way it hasn't. There will be, particularly because the state needs external investment for Neom to happen, in a way that is perhaps slightly unusual. So there's going to be a need to demonstrate that certain standards can be met. Now, will that be met by turning Neom into a sort of regulatory bubble and saying, we're going to have different laws and standards here? Well, certainly that hasn't happened yet, right? That it's not like we're seeing some kind of oasis or haven. In fact, quite the opposite. So far, this has been a human rights disaster. So I think the question is, how is the state going to respond when the world wants to know in a way that it perhaps hasn't really before, the international business community, because they then risk being complicit in a way that, again, perhaps it's not new for international businesses to be complicit in human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia, but perhaps for that to be so high profile.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll take another question from the audience.
Thank you. My name is Ray Hanadin, also from Middle East Eye. So I wanted to ask, probably to Lina, so the report notes quite a clear correlation between the death sentences and also the extension of length of prison sentences with the rehabilitation of MBS on the world stage. So I just wanted to ask for your comments on what that says about Western governments who once treated MBS as a pariah, who are now kind of welcoming him to their country, or vice versa, and the impacts of kind of diplomacy on individuals in Saudi Arabia, people whose sentences have been extended from 2 years, 3 years to 50 years, how, a handshake between Biden and MBS is kind of resulting in these very real impact. What does that say about these governments, in particular ones like the US, where a lot of the foreign companies that are working on Neom are based in these countries? And then on the corporate side of things, we've contacted some of these companies in the past about their involvement in Neom. To be honest, a lot of the time we don't get much of a response, or we get very, very vague responses. But as the report outlines, some of the things that are happening in Neom are contravening the UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights, and potentially contravening international law as well. So I just wanted to ask, what do we do to get people to reply? If they're not replying about these kind of clear violations, and you mentioned there's quite stringent laws in some areas in the EU when it comes to business and human rights. So, yeah, is there any particular laws that we should be kind of referencing to kind of force people to reply on this, or is it almost based on public image rather than kind of the legality of it?
Thank you very much. And if it's all right, I would maybe answer the last question first, and then we can go to sort of the bit of the political, diplomatic angle after. Any takers?
I think there's a couple of things. One is that it's about finding kind of champions and allies on the one hand, but also about finding areas of leverage. And for us, that means looking at other business relationships. So, and it really depends which particular companies, so which particular sectors are kind of being under pressure. But I think, you know, and it usually is, for example, investors we mentioned already, but anyone with sort of larger clout who can incorporate those and should already be incorporating those, the UN guiding principles into their engagement with these companies. But actually, I think in a less sophisticated answer, but I do think sometimes actually what is needed is a scandal. It is PR, it is image, which I think has driven a lot of companies to accept work on what is this really big, flashy, exciting project. And I think that sometimes, particularly at the sort of start of engagement, actually it will take something like a scandal to make companies sort of sit up and respond. The danger, of course, is making sure that companies don't simply cut and run. Because I think that's another thing that we see is that we take these allegations of human rights abuse to companies, we frame it in a, this is an opportunity for you to investigate, to engage with this on some kind of deeper level. And so what is important is to try and make sure that companies don't simply stop operating there, to the detriment of livelihoods. We've seen that previously with the hospitality industry, particularly when it comes to migrant workers and risks sort of further down the sort of labor supply chain. And we don't want to sort of replicate that. But I do think that sometimes a sort of short, sharp shock has to happen for companies to actually take it seriously. But other than that, I think it's identifying allies, either political allies or other corporate stakeholders, and sort of applying pressure there.
Yeah, just a final thought, which is that, given what we were talking about earlier, the extremely difficult questions that companies have to ask themselves if they're going to operate in this environment, the fact that there is such opacity and companies aren't responding or are responding curtly without any details is like beyond worrying. And I think that, if you're asking the question of should companies be there, like the absolute bare minimum is they have to be extremely transparent about how they're addressing these issues. And that is not happening now. So yeah, it's alarm bells are ringing.
Thank you. And now maybe we can kind of spin it a bit further, including the political framework or situation.
Yes, I can elaborate, but I'll try to be a bit, summarize the situation a bit. So yes, basically, if we see the title of our report last year was "The Spotlight Fades, Repression Mounts," and I think, it's very telling of the situation in Saudi Arabia. And after the murder of Khashoggi, as everyone knows, I think there was a kind of not improvement in the human rights situation, but a kind of stagnation. There was no new crackdowns. Even trials were suspended for a while because they didn't want, to sentence people to heavy sentences. And I think, that the government knew that the world was watching and they couldn't really do another mistake, basically. And what we've seen is that, as soon as MBS was rehabilitated, the first Western visit being Boris Johnson, we saw a new wave of mass executions. And then directly after that, after the visit of MBS in Paris and Biden's handshake, we saw the lengthy sentences that were really unprecedented, including the 45 years and 34 years of women who were only tweeting. So yes, the correlation is clear. I think that we cannot say that it is. We have all the evidence, and the government doesn't even want to hide it. It's being clear to the people that I have a green light to repress you. You are muzzled, and the world is protecting me. So I think yes, everything has been documented, and it's clear that the more MBS is rehabilitated, the more things. the worse things get, unfortunately.
Thank you, Lina. And if there are no further kind of comments, questions, we'll probably wrap it up here. I think, yeah, it's been a very interesting discussion. I would like to thank the panelists for their inputs. And I think once more, we've really seen that like international scrutiny does help, especially I think for the Saudi context, for a country that seeks, to present this new image and to also gain international legitimacy. So both political stakeholders, but also business stakeholders really have a role to play here to address these violations. And in our report, there are some recommendations both to businesses and to the Saudi authorities. So I'll encourage you, have a read. It's public now. Thank you very much for joining, and thank you for the conversation.